Officially, this prison did not exist. There was no address you could look up on a map, no street name to punch into your GPS. If you tried to find it in public records, you'd come up with nothing but empty filing cabinets and dead ends. And according to the government, there were no prisoners held there. It was a ghost, a phantom facility, a void in the system. When questioned, officials would stand at polished podiums under the weight of national seals and confidently state that the place was a fiction, a conspiracy theory whispered by malcontents. But people kept disappearing. One day they were walking their dog, grabbing a coffee, or heading to work, and the next, they were just gone, vanished without a trace. Their families would file missing person reports, plastering posters on every telephone pole and shop window, their faces etched with a desperate hope. That slowly turned to despair. These weren't criminals in the traditional sense. There were no charges filed against them, no dramatic courtroom trials, no gavel striking down a final judgment. They were simply erased from public life, leaving behind a deafening silence and a void of unanswered questions. Their loved ones were left to wait, caught in an agonizing limbo, with no explanations, no closure, just an empty space at the dinner table. In the vacuum of information, rumors began to circulate. They started as quiet whispers in dark corners, hushed conversations over crackling phone lines. People spoke of a place, a destination for those who were taken away in the dead of night. They talked about unmarked transport vans with blacked-out windows, speeding down deserted highways. It was a place where detainees were sent and then completely, utterly unacknowledged. Their very existence was scrubbed from the record, their names stamped over with thick, black lines of redaction. When the press, fueled by these persistent whispers, confronted officials, the response was always the same, a firm, unwavering denial. There is no such facility, they would say, the bright lights of the press conference glinting off their impassive faces. The message was clear: stop asking questions. But you can't make something disappear just by saying it isn't there. The truth has a way of seeping through the cracks. Locals living miles away from the supposed location reported strange activities. They saw the silhouettes of armed guards patrolling perimeters that weren't on any official map. They watched as massive, intimidating fences, topped with razor-sharp barbed wire, were erected in the middle of nowhere, carving out a piece of land that belonged to no one. They saw military supply trucks rumbling down back roads at odd hours, their heavy tires kicking up dust, their cargo hidden under thick canvas tarps. And most tellingly, they heard the unmistakable roar of aircraft landing at a makeshift runway. Always under the cover of total darkness, the evidence, though circumstantial, was piling up. It painted a picture that was impossible to ignore. Something was there, shrouded in fog and secrecy, a sprawling complex deliberately hidden from the world's view. Something was being concealed behind those towering fences and locked steel doors. And if there was a place that needed to be hidden so desperately, with so much effort and at such great expense, it meant someone was inside, someone whose story was being forcibly silenced. You could feel their presence in the coldness of the steel bars, in the unspoken fear that hung in the air. But officially, of course, nothing existed. The government maintained its story, the records remained empty, and the world was told to look the other way. The question wasn't just what this place was, but why it was being hidden, and what secrets it held for those who had vanished into its depths. The truth was out there, buried under layers of denial, waiting to be unearthed. Imagine a place where the rules you know simply don't apply. This isn't a story from a dystopian novel. It's a chilling reality that unfolded in the shadows of our modern world. In this hidden place, the people brought there weren't called prisoners. That word, prisoner, implies a legal process, rights, a system. Instead, they were given a different label, something much more ambiguous, something that stripped them of their legal standing from the very start. On paper, and in the sterile language of official dom, they were simply detainees, and they weren't in prison. They were held in cold, featureless cells, held indefinitely. The distinction is crucial. To be in prison means you've been charged with a crime, but here, there were no charges. Charge sheets remained blank, pristine documents untouched by accusation. To be in prison means you've been sentenced by a court of law, but here, there was no sentence. Calendars were meaningless, their pages torn, because time had lost its structure. And most terrifyingly, to be in prison usually means you have a release date, a day to count down to. Here, there was no end in sight. Clocks had no hints, spinning uselessly, mocking the very concept of a future. This was a world designed to break the human spirit, engineered with a chilling precision. The cells were windowless concrete boxes, completely sealed off from the outside world. No sunlight, no moonlight, no way to gauge the passing of the day. To further disorient them, harsh overhead lights stayed on 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. There was no day, no night, only a constant, grueling brightness. Sleep wasn't a right. It was a privilege, granted and taken away at the whim of the guards. It became another tool of control. And then there was the silence, not a peaceful quiet, but an oppressive, enforced silence. Any attempt to communicate, to whisper a word of comfort to another soul, was forbidden. A finger to the lips wasn't a suggestion. It was a command backed by severe consequences. The very essence of who they were was systematically erased. Their names, the first gift their parents ever gave them, were stripped away and replaced with a cold, impersonal number. They ceased to be individuals and became inventory. The isolation was absolute, a psychological fortress built around each detainee. Contact with family was strictly forbidden. Phones would ring unanswered. Letters would never arrive. The connection to loved ones, the lifeline that keeps hope alive, was severed completely. The legal system, the supposed bedrock of a just society, was a locked door. Lawyers who came seeking their clients were denied access, turned away by signs and guards who answered to a different authority. Basic human needs were treated as bargaining chips. Medical care was minimal, almost an afterthought. The infirmary was often empty, a stage set with no actors. Pain, illness, and injury were either ignored or met with inadequate, cursory attention. And if anyone dared to complain, their grievances vanished into a void. Suggestion boxes were locked shut, a cynical joke in a place where no one was listening. The message was clear: you are powerless, and no one is coming to help you. The days bled into weeks, weeks into months, and months into years. Some were held in this limbo for a decade or more. They marked the time with crude tallies scratched onto the concrete walls. The only calendar that mattered. All this time, they never saw a judge, never stood in a courtroom, never had the chance to face an accuser. The scales of justice, often depicted as blind, were here blindfolded and bound, unable to weigh the evidence because none was ever presented. The only consistent interaction was interrogation. These sessions were routine, a constant feature of their existence, held in stark, intimidating rooms. But oversight, the mechanism meant to prevent abuse and ensure fairness, it was non-existent. Security cameras were broken or pointed at the ceiling. The entire facility operated completely outside the established legal framework, like an island fortress beyond the borders of any known map. Why? Why go to such extreme lengths to create a place of legal nothingness? Because acknowledging the existence of these detainees within the normal system would have created a cascade of legal problems. It would have meant granting them rights, access to lawyers, and a fair trial. The government couldn't afford that. So a simple, brutal policy was adopted. Denial, a giant denied stamp, was slammed down on reality itself. And to protect this policy of denial, the entire operation was shrouded in the deepest secrecy. It became a fortress of locked vaults and classified documents. Secrecy became the ultimate protection, the shield that allowed these horrors to continue, hidden from public view and legal scrutiny. But history teaches us one undeniable lesson: secrecy never lasts forever. The truth, no matter how deeply buried, always finds a way to the surface. Walls, no matter how thick, eventually crack, and that's what happened here. Someone, an individual with a conscience, who could no longer bear the weight of what they knew, eventually talked. A shadowed whistleblower stepped forward, and the first cracks appeared in the wall of silence. The story of this hidden place, and the people lost within it, began to spill out into the light. Everything changed when the leaks began. It started with a trickle, then became a flood. Internal documents, memos, and reports started surfacing, papers spilling from folders once thought to be sealed forever. These weren't just random files. They were the hidden architecture of a secret world. Suddenly, we had flight logs, detailed manifests of unmarked aircraft crisscrossing the globe, landing in places they were never supposed to be. The logs named names, listed dates, and traced routes that officials had long sworn didn't exist. The paper trail was damning, a concrete record of clandestine movements. Then came the images. High-resolution satellite photos provided a bird's-eye view of the compound. We could see the layout, the guard towers, the stark, windowless buildings. These weren't just abstract blueprints. They were undeniable proof of the facility's existence and scale. The satellite images corroborated the leaked documents, painting a picture that was becoming harder and harder to dismiss as fiction. The secrecy that had shrouded the prison for so long was beginning to fray at the edges, pierced by the unblinking eye of technology from above. Alongside the documents and images, a human element emerged. Former staff members, their identities concealed in silhouette, began to speak out. Their testimonies were chilling. They spoke of the daily routines, the interrogations, the psychological toll on both the prisoners and themselves. These weren't third-hand accounts. They were first-hand narratives from people who had been on the inside. They described the sounds, the smells, the pervasive atmosphere of fear and despair. Their voices, though digitally altered, carried the weight of truth and remorse, adding a deeply personal and disturbing layer to the growing mountain of evidence. With this trifecta of evidence, documents, satellite imagery, and eyewitness testimony, journalists finally had what they needed to start asking serious questions. The story broke, and a firestorm erupted. Reporters armed with microphones and notepads descended on press briefings, demanding accountability. They weren't just asking about rumors anymore. They were presenting cold, hard facts. The questions were pointed, specific, and backed by a portfolio of leaked materials that seemed irrefutable. The media, once kept at arm's length, was now at the very gates of power, refusing to be turned away. The government's response was swift, predictable, and absolute. They denied everything. At a hastily arranged press conference, a spokesperson stood behind a podium and delivered a firm, unequivocal statement. The documents were forgeries, the images were doctored, and the testimonies were from disgruntled, unreliable sources. It was a blanket denial, a wall of official repudiation designed to shut down the story before it could gain any more traction. There was no nuance, no partial admission, just a flat, resounding no. But the evidence was too compelling to simply disappear. So, the denials continued, again and again and again. Every new piece of information that surfaced was met with the same response. It became a monotonous cycle. Journalists would publish a new finding, and the government would issue another denial. News headlines stacked up, each one a variation on the same theme. Officials reject claims. Government denies allegations. Report labeled as fabrication. The word denied seemed to be stamped in bold red letters across every official communication on the matter. When the sheer volume of denials failed to quell the growing public outcry, the official strategy shifted. The narrative changed from "it didn't happen" to "we can't talk about it." Suddenly, the justification for the wall of silence was national security. Officials invoked the phrase like a magic charm, a catch-all reason to classify information and evade scrutiny. It was a powerful argument, designed to frame any further inquiry as unpatriotic and dangerous. The prison, its activities, and everyone associated with it were now shielded behind the formidable seal of the state. This national security defense proved incredibly effective in the legal arena. Attempts to bring the matter before the courts were consistently blocked. Judges, citing state secrets privilege, dismissed lawsuits filed by human rights organizations and the families of the detained. The gavel, a symbol of justice, was rendered powerless. Hidden behind a barrier of legal technicalities and executive power, the one avenue that might have offered a path to truth and accountability was systematically closed off, leaving advocates with nowhere to turn. As the legal challenges failed, official investigations also ground to a halt. Congressional committees would launch inquiries, only to find their progress stalled. They would request documents and be told the records were now classified. What was once an internal report was now stamped top secret, placing it beyond the reach of oversight. Progress bars on government websites tracking these investigations would stop, frozen indefinitely. The entire apparatus of inquiry, from congressional hearings to internal reviews, was paralyzed by the deliberate and strategic classification of information. The situation grew even more sinister. It wasn't just that information was being withheld, it was actively disappearing. Key pieces of evidence vanished. Boxes of files went missing from secure archives. Digital records were mysteriously wiped. The very documents that had started the entire investigation were now being systematically purged. Shredded papers became a potent symbol of this effort to erase history, to destroy the proof so completely that it would be as if it never existed at all. It was a calculated campaign to create a factual vacuum. Simultaneously, a vicious campaign began to discredit the witnesses. The brave individuals who had come forward, the former staff members, found their characters and credibility under attack. Smear campaigns, orchestrated through anonymous leaks to friendly media outlets, painted them as liars, opportunists, or mentally unstable. Their personal lives were dissected, their motives questioned, and their careers ruined. The message was clear: if you speak out, you will be destroyed. This tactic was designed not only to silence the current witnesses, but also to deter any others who might be considering coming forward. Despite the intimidation and the stonewalling, the families of the detained refused to be silenced. They organized, protested, and relentlessly demanded answers. They held vigils outside government buildings, their faces etched with grief and determination. They held up signs with pictures of their loved ones, simple placards asking, "Where's my father?" or "What happened to my brother?" Their pleas were a constant, human reminder of the real-world cost of this state-sanctioned secrecy. They were the conscience of the story, refusing to let the world forget the people at the heart of the scandal. But for most of these families, their questions were met with a cold, unyielding silence. Their letters went unanswered. Their calls were not returned. They would seek meetings with officials only to be turned away at the front desk, confronted by a locked office door. They received no confirmations, no denials, no information whatsoever. They were left in a state of perpetual limbo, a cruel and agonizing uncertainty. Most would never receive the answers they so desperately sought. The system had closed ranks, leaving them on the outside, alone with their grief. And all the while, the prison continued to operate. Under the cover of darkness, the lights inside the compound still burned. The daily routines of confinement and interrogation carried on, hidden from the world but very much real. The official public denials were a facade, a parallel reality constructed for public consumption. The truth was that the facility was still active, a functioning part of a clandestine system, even as the world was being told it didn't exist. This contradiction, the public denial versus the secret reality, became impossible to ignore. It was like looking into a broken mirror, where the conflicting images stared back. On one side was the government's official face, calm and reassuring. On the other was the fractured, ugly truth revealed by the leaks and testimonies. The gap between what was being said and what was actually happening had grown into a chasm. The cognitive dissonance was palpable, and the government's credibility was shattering. The story, not too big to be contained within one nation's borders, triggered a global reaction. International pressure began to grow. Allies who had once been complicit or silent started asking their own questions. World leaders, during diplomatic meetings, began to raise the issue behind closed doors. Human rights commissions at the United Nations launched their own inquiries. The scandal was no longer a domestic issue. It was a matter of international concern, and the world was watching. With the combined weight of domestic protest, relentless media coverage, and international condemnation, it became clear that the status quo was unsustainable. Something had to change. The pressure had reached a tipping point. The strategy of total denial and obstruction had failed. Acknowledgement, in some form, was now inevitable. The only question was what that acknowledgement would look like and what consequences would follow. In the end, there was a shift. A new administration came in, and with it, a public disavowal of the program. The prison was officially, and this time, actually, shut down. But true accountability would prove to be limited. While the policy was changed, the architects of that policy were largely shielded from consequences. There were no high-level prosecutions, no real reckoning for the individuals who had designed and run the system. A shadow of impunity hung over the courthouse. The chapter was closed, but the story didn't have a just ending. A painful truth was acknowledged, but justice, for many, remained elusive. In the end, after years of silence and steadfast denial, the wall of secrecy began to crack, not with a bang, but with a carefully worded whisper. The government, facing mounting pressure from internal leaks, international watchdogs, and the tireless work of journalists and activists, finally admitted parts of the truth. A press release, a quiet Friday afternoon news dump, acknowledged the existence of certain facilities and enhanced interrogation techniques. It was a masterclass in political maneuvering, a statement designed to concede as little as possible while giving the appearance of transparency. But it was never the full story. Crucial details were omitted, timelines were manipulated, and the true scale of the operation remained shrouded in classification. Key documents were released, but with entire pages blacked out, leaving more questions than answers. The half-revealed truth was perhaps more insidious than the outright lie. With this partial admission came a bureaucratic reshuffling. The prison, this ghost facility that had officially never existed, was now a problem to be managed. Some of these sites were reclassified, their names changed overnight. A detention center became a logistical support annex, a simple change on a signpost meant to erase a history of pain. Other compounds, those too infamous or too difficult to repurpose, were quietly decommissioned. Gates were locked, guard towers were abandoned, and nature was left to reclaim the concrete and razor wire, leaving behind a modern ruin, a monument to a secret sin. For the people held within those walls, the end was not a clean break. Some detainees, those whose cases had become public or whose home countries had intervened, were released. News cameras captured fleeting images of men blinking in the sunlight, stepping through a gate into a world that had moved on without them. But their freedom was the exception, not the rule. Many others were simply transferred, loaded onto unmarked planes and convoys in the dead of night, moved to other black sites, or handed over to allied nations with even more questionable human rights records. They vanished from one ledger only to appear on another, or not at all. And then there were the ghosts, the individuals who were never publicly accounted for. Their files went missing. Their names were scrubbed from records. They became administrative errors, statistical anomalies in a system designed to make people disappear. For their families, the nightmare didn't end. It just became a permanent state of unknowing. And what are the architects of this system? The officials who signed the memos, who drafted the legal justifications, who gave the orders. They faced no real consequences. No high-ranking official ever saw the inside of a prison cell for their role in the program. There were no indictments, no trials for the masterminds. At most, a few low-level contractors or soldiers were reprimanded for exceeding their authority, becoming convenient scapegoats. For a systemic policy, the system protected its own. There were no clear, unequivocal apologies. Instead, there were carefully phrased expressions of regret that abuses may have occurred, language that sidestepped responsibility and offered no catharsis to the victims. The podiums where true reckoning could have taken place remained silent. Compensation, a tangible acknowledgement of harm, was almost non-existent. The legal battles were long, arduous, and prohibitively expensive for former detainees, many of whom were left psychologically scarred and financially destitute. The government invoked state secrets and national security to have cases dismissed before they could ever be heard on their merits. The few settlements that were reached came with strict non-disclosure agreements, purchasing silence and burying the story even deeper. An uncashed check became a symbol of this, hollow justice on offer that could never truly repay the debt owed. Perhaps the most chilling legacy of all was the legal precedent that remained, the legal opinions, the secret memos, the reinterpretation of international law. They were never fully repudiated. They sit in government archives like a loaded gun. The lesson learned by those in power was not that such actions were wrong, but that they were possible. A prison denied once could exist again. The blueprint for a shadow carceral state had been drafted, tested, and proven viable. The mechanisms of secrecy and denial had been ruthlessly effective. By controlling the flow of information, by classifying the truth into oblivion, and by issuing firm, repeated denials, the government had successfully managed public perception for years. And when the truth began to emerge, the strategy shifted to obfuscation and partial admission. It worked. The public, overwhelmed by a complex story with no clear heroes or villains and no satisfying conclusion, eventually moved on. The news cycle churned forward, and the secret prisons faded from the headlines, becoming a footnote in a turbulent decade. But for those who lived it, the damage remained. It lingered in the form of chronic pain, of PTSD, of families torn apart. It manifested in the silhouette of a former detainee, unable to escape the shadow of the cell they once occupied. This prison, and the network it was part of, was not an accident. It wasn't a case of a few bad apples or a policy that spun out of control. It was a decision, a deliberate choice made by people in quiet conference rooms, far from the public eye. It was a policy born in silence and hidden in the deepest vaults of secrecy, locked away in file drawers marked top secret. It was a reality that was denied, vehemently and repeatedly, right up until the moment that denial was no longer sustainable, when the walls of the lie began to crumble under the weight of the truth. This was the story of the prison the government said didn't exist.